Be'ezras Hashem, with Hashem's help, we're beginning a new set of halachot, a new set of laws, Hilchos Temurah. It's one of the rarer parts of the Torah. I don't think most Jews are familiar with this concept. What is Temurah? Temurah means exchange. And basically it deals with the mitzvah or the prohibition that when you have an animal that's a sacrifice, you cannot exchange that animal for another animal, even if you think the second animal is better. You cannot say, I want to transfer the holiness from this animal to that animal. Truth is, even in the same animal, we're also going to see another prohibition, you cannot switch the type of sacrifice. So if you have an animal that's supposed to be a peace offering, you can't switch it to a burnt offering. So these are both types of valid exchanges that the Torah recognizes. Now the funny thing with exchange is that you're not allowed to do it, but if you did it, it works. That's how the Torah makes the penalty. You're not supposed to do it, but if you did it, we're going to fine you, and both animals become holy. This is clear in the Torah. I want to show you the verses here because we're going to be quoting it again and again. The laws of Temurah appear at the end of the book of Vayikra, which, by the way, the Rabbi once pointed out, it's a fascinating thing. The book of Vayikra is the book of sacrifices in the Torah, right? What's the last thing discussed in the book of Vayikra? Temurah, the laws of exchange. Which book are we studying right now from the Rambam? The book of sacrifices. What does he put at the end? He put the laws of Temurah at the end. He models the written Torah. Yeah. So what does it say? Torah, it says, there's two verses. First it says, Lo yachalifenu v'lo yamiroto. On the screen you see, you shouldn't exchange it. Tov b'ra or ra b'tov. Good for bad or bad for good. And then Torah says, V'im hamer yamir behema b'vehema. If you do switch an animal for another animal, v'hayahu usmurasa yiyah kodesh. It and the exchange are holy. A couple of verses later, it says the exact same thing. Look over here. Lo yevaker ben tov l'ra v'lo yamiranu. Don't check good or bad animals or exchange them. V'im hamer yamiranu. If you do exchange them, v'hayahu usmurasa yiyah kodesh. Both it and its exchange are holy. Lo yigoel, they cannot be redeemed. So in other words, you see this concept twice. Torah repeats that Temurah should not be done, but if it's done, it works. Now, there are certain cases where all you have is the prohibition and not the fine. That means you're only not allowed to do it, but if you do it, it doesn't work. And that's going to be two important terms to remember for these whole halachot. Whenever the Rambam says the word oiseh temurah, it makes an exchange. That means that the exchange should not be done, but if it's done, it works. If the Rambam says einay oiseh temurah, it doesn't make exchange. What that means is it's not able to. You shouldn't exchange it, but even if you did, it doesn't work. Just those two terms to always remember. As the Rambam always does, he gives us the mitzvahs that we're going to discuss in the set of laws. Yesh b'chlalan shalish mitzvahs. Included in this laws is three mitzvahs. Achas mitzvahs aseh, ushtayim mitzvahs leis aseh. One positive mitzvah, two negative mitzvahs. V'zehu pratan, and these are their details. Aleph shelo yamir behema b'vehema. The basic mitzvah, you shall not exchange one animal for another. Beis, shatiyah hatmura kodesh im hemer. It's a positive mitzvah. Torah says, if you did do the exchange, which you weren't supposed to, but if you did, the exchange is also holy. Gimel shalay yeshana hakadashim mikdusha likdusha. Once you have one type of sacrifice, you shouldn't change it from one holiness to another. Ubir mitzvahs elu b'prakim elu. The explanation of these mitzvahs is coming in the following 4 chapters. Pretty short set of laws. The final set of laws in this book. Perek Rishon, chapter 1, halacha aleph. Kol hamemir. Anybody who exchanges, and memir refers to exchanging animals. One animal for another.
Only animals?
Huh?
Only animals?
Yeah. It doesn't apply to birds, we're going to see. Yeah, only animals. Loikal kol behema o behema sheyamir. He gets separate lashes for every animal which he switches. Shenemar, because the Torah says, here it is, le'yachalifenu v'leyamir reisei. You shall not exchange it or exchange it. 2 different words for exchange. V'afal pi shalei asa ma'aseh. This is a big chidush. Even though you didn't do an action. In Torah, we have an ironclad rule. Mipi hashmu alamdu, we learn from tradition, shekol mitzvahs leisa say she'ein b'maiseh ein leikin aleha. That every time you have a negative commandment that doesn't involve an action, you don't get lashes for violating it. Chutz, with 3 exceptions. Minishba, somebody swears falsely, all you did is talk, right? You still get lashes. Umeimir, you exchange. Again, it's an ethereal action, it's not a practical action. Umikalalas chavere b'shem, and somebody, God forbid, curses his friend using God's name. Shloi shalavin elu. These 3 prohibitions. Efshar sheyiyah behen ma'aseh klal. It's impossible to do them with an action. You cannot swear with an action. You cannot exchange with an action. And still v'leikin aleim. Still you get lashes. So the fact that it doesn't have an action is not a problem because we have a tradition that over here is different. There's another question we have to address. I have another reason. Why should we get lashes over Temurah? V'harei lav sheba nitak la'aseh. The prohibition is directly linked to a positive commandment. Shenemar, as it says, V'im hamer yimiranu, this verse over here, if you do exchange it, V'hayahu usmurasa yeh kaidesh, it and its exchange should be holy. That means whenever Torah gives you an opportunity to fix a negative with a positive, you don't get lashes for the negative. Classic example is robbery. Torah says you shouldn't steal, but then it says if you did, v'heishiv esagzela asher gazal, you return the stolen object. Therefore, if somebody actually robs, they don't get lashes, because you always have the chance to give it back. So here also, you weren't supposed to do the exchange, but now that you did, Torah gives you a way to fix it, so to speak. The positive commandment, keep them both holy. So why do you get lashes? Says the Rambam, first of all, lav hanitak la'aseh only works if it's one against one. One negative commandment versus one positive commandment. Here in Temurah, we have one positive commandment, but two negative commandments. And so the one aseh cannot cancel out both lavin. Furthermore, she'ein lav sheba shave la'aseh. The negative part is not fully equal to the positive part. I mentioned to you this just before. Usually, you're not supposed to do it, and if you do it, it works. But not always does it work. Shahatzibur v'hashutfin, here's an example. The community and partners, ein oisin temurah im heimiru. They don't effectuate. It doesn't work, the exchange, if they did it. Afal pi shehein muzharin shelo yamiru. Even though they have a clear prohibition not to do it. So for them, they don't have a way to fix it. Right? They just have the negative, don't exchange. And if they do, it doesn't work. Therefore, everybody always gets lashes for doing it. It turns out that you say like this. If an individual does Temurah, the exchange is holy. Even if you did it on Shabbat, you still get 40 lashes for just the Temurah. But if a partner does Temurah, one of the partners, or somebody does Temurah to the community sacrifices, since they have a portion in it, every Jew has a portion in the communal sacrifices, you get lashes, but the Temurah in this case is not holy. Why? Because you're part of a community, you're part of partners. The Rambam doesn't explain why partners and community are different. The Rebbe once said it could be based on what the Rambam says in the end of these laws. In chapter 4, the Rambam explains one of the reasons for Temurah, which is that a person, in the end, might use it to his gain. He'll have a better quality animal, and then he'll exchange it for a worse quality animal, but he'll say it's better. It's better, and then meanwhile he walks away getting the benefit. But when you're a partner, you only get half the benefit, not as much. When you're part of a community, you get almost no benefit. So therefore, the point of Temurah doesn't exist. And therefore, the effect of it also doesn't exist. You know, in Sefer Yetzirah, in Kabbalah, it says, Na'utz tchilatan b'sofan. The beginning is always wedged in the end. So here you see an example of that in Halacha. The first law, the very first law of Temurah, gets explained by the last law of Temurah. Interesting concept. Halacha base. We're going to get a bunch of individual details in today's chapter about Temurah. Echad hameimir b'zadin sheheimra bishgaga. It doesn't matter whether you did this exchange purposely or by mistake. And we'll soon see what by mistake means. It has a very limited definition. The Temurah works, the exchange works, and you get lashes. Ketzad, what is an example of mistake? Hamiskavin loimar, if somebody means to say, Harezu tmuras oila sheyeshli, I want this animal to be the exchange of the burnt offering that I have, v'amar, and instead he says, Harezu tmuras shlamim sheyeshli. I want it to be the exchange of the peace offering. That's a mistake. Meaning, you knew that it's prohibited to do what you're doing. You just said the wrong words. You wanted to exchange it for that animal, and instead you exchanged it for this one. Harezu Temurah v'leika. That's where we say that it's Temurah and you get lashes. Avalim dima shemutar lahamir v'heimir. But if the mistake was that you thought that it's actually permitted to do the Temurah, and therefore you did it, oisha amar, or you said, ekanes lebayezeva amr midaiti. I want to go into this house and do Temurah with full awareness. V'nichnas v'shachach v'heimir shalei midaita. Then he goes in and he forgets. And he does the Temurah unawarely, harezu Temurah ve'ein leika Allah. While the Temurah works, you don't get lashes, but that's not a mistake. Halacha gimel. Ein adam meimer behemte bekarban she'ein shaloi. A person, you have an animal, you cannot exchange it onto a sacrifice that's not yours. Even though only you're bearing the cost, right? In other words, let's say it's your sacrifice. You have an animal sitting in your backyard that's going to be a sheep for a burnt offering. Comes me and says, hey, you know what? Philip's sacrifice should become mine. go on to my animal. Doesn't work. Unless, if the owner of the sacrifice clearly announced, anybody who wants to do this sin, this Temurah on my animal, can come do it, then since you've given the allowance to everybody, then anybody can do it. On the other hand, what if it's your sacrifice, somebody else's animal? That of course not doesn't work. Doesn't even work. You cannot sanctify something that's not yours, right? Think about it. What is Temurah? Temurah means I have a holy animal and I want the holiness to go onto that animal. But if that animal is yours, it's not in my prerogative to make it holy. Halacha Dalid, another general rule, Hamiskaper hu sha'isa Temurah. The person who is achieving atonement is the one who effectuates Temurah. Avaloi hamaktish, not necessarily the one who made the animal holy. What does this mean? Ketzad. Hikdish behema sheyiskaper b'chavere. Let's say you were a nice guy, and you sanctified an animal for somebody else to use. You have a friend who's a Nazirite, and you are donating the animals. Here, this is going to be holy for my friend the Nazir. So who can do Temurah? Only the Nazirite, the one who's going to use those sacrifices for his atonement, is the one who could effectuate Temurah. But not the person who sanctified the animals, because if you think about it, they're not yours anymore.
Yeah.
You gave them away for the other guy. Halacha hey, hayoresh meimir. An heir, an inheritor, could do Temurah. A father puts away a sacrifice, father dies, now the son owns the sacrifice. If the son wants to exchange it to another animal, it will work. It's forbidden, but it will work. Hiniach behema lishnei banav ames. What happens if the dad had two sons? Same case. Father puts away a sacrifice, he dies, and there's two sons now. Harezu kreva ve'ein memirin ba. It will still be offered on the father's behalf, but if they try to do Temurah, it won't work. Sharehim bashutfin. Because two sons equally own the estate. They're partners. And partners cannot effectuate Temurah, as we just explained. Halacha Vav, another rule. Ein kadshe nachrim oisin Temurah min atayra. Biblically, sacrifices that are offered by non-Jews, which are allowed to be offered, as we've seen in the past, but they cannot have Temurah done to them. But the Rabbi said, that if a guy does Temurah, it is Temurah. In other words, we're going to impose the fine on that animal too, and it'll also become holy. What if a Gentile is the nice guy from the other scenario? Gentile has a friend who's a Jew. He knows the Jew needs a sacrifice. He donates the sacrifice. He makes the animal holy. And now the guy does the Temurah. So before we said that if a Jew does that for another Jew, it doesn't work. You can't do Temurah on that animal because it's not yours anymore. Here says the Rambam, when it comes to a guy, harezu sveik Temurah. It's a doubt whether it's a Temurah. Halacha Zayin, echad anashim ve'echad nashim im hemiru eisin Temurah. Both men and women. This is a mitzvah that applies to everybody. If a man or a woman does the Temurah, it works. And they've transgressed the prohibition. Ches katan shehigia lo einas nadarim. Even a child that has reached the time when he's allowed to make vows, between 12 and 13 years old, shehemir, and he did the Temurah act, afal pisha ein leika, even though for sure he doesn't get lashes, yesh by safek im isa Temurah eina isa Temurah. There's a doubt whether his verbal declaration is powerful enough to make Temurah or not. So it's not so simple. You have to be careful and not let this child do this prohibition. Halacha tes ein hakoyanim mimirin bechatas uva asham. We have a sin offering. And the sin offering, technically if you think about it, partially belongs to a Kohen. Because the Kohen's going to be getting the meat. In fact, only the Kohen's going to be getting the meat. The only person that can eat the chatas is the Kohen. So the question now is, can the Kohen do Temurah with a sin offering or a guilt offering? Here he is in the temple, right? This is the animal that's going to be a chatas, and he wants to switch it for this animal. Says the Rambam, they don't have the power. Sha'afal pishahim shalahem. Even though the chatas belongs to the Kohanim, einon zeichen behen mechayim. They don't own it when it's still alive. She'ein lahem babasar ad she'yizarek hadam. Because they only have rights to the meat once the blood is sprinkled. And therefore, while it's alive, they can't do Temurah. Also, ve'ein ha'kohanim mimirim babchayra. The Kohanim cannot do Temurah on a bechor animal, even though again, it's going to them. Sha'afal pishu zeichen behen mechayim. Even though over there you do own it from life, different than the chatas, even in the animal's lifetime, the Kohen owns it. Ein zeichen behen mitchila. We had the laws of the firstborn a couple weeks ago. The Kohen doesn't get it right away. Who it always begins in the house of the Jew, and the Jew must give it to the Kohen. But if the owners, the Jew who owned the Bechor to begin with, if they did Temurah to the Bechor, Kol Zman Shu Bebeisam, as long as it's in their house, Oisim Temurah. They could effectuate the exchange will work. Also, if a Kohen has a Bechor in his own home, which we said in that set of laws, that a Kohen is obligated in the laws of Bechor, even if it's his own animal. But the point is, in this case, it begins in his home. Loi beBechor, shlakach mi Yisrael, not a Bechor which he takes from a Jewish person. The one that he owns himself, harezu Temurah, then it will be an exchange. Because the whole reason why he can't do it is because he doesn't have it at the beginning. Here, he does have it at the beginning, therefore the exchange works. Halacha Yud, on Yom Kippur, we learned that the Kohen Gadol would bring two animals. There was a ram and there was a bull. That it was a personal sacrifice that he would bring on behalf of himself and his family and the Kohen. So the Rambam says, Eilei shel Kohen Gadol, oiset Temurah. The ram that the high priest would bring, it's a completely personal sacrifice, and therefore, if he doesn't exchange on it, middle of Yom Kippur, the Temurah works. Aval paroi eino oiset Temurah, but the bull, no. Why? Afal pishu mishaloi, even though he sponsors it, it comes from his own possession. Hoyil ve'echav hakoyanim miskaprin boy, since also all his brothers, the Kohanim, achieve atonement through it, harehim boy keshutfin, they're like a partner. And partners cannot effectuate Temurah. Halacha Yud Aleph, ha'oifes v'hamenachais einon oisin Temurah. Birds, flower offerings, don't have the laws of exchange. Shaloi nemar ella behema. Look in the Torah. Torah only uses the word behema. The whole time talking about Temurah, ve'im behema, asher yakrivu, ve'im hamar yamri behema, b'behema, all animals. So only animals have this law, not birds and flower offerings. Halacha Yud Beis, carbonized bedek habayis. Had this a few times already. When you sanctify an animal to the Beis HaMikdash, there could be two reasons why you're doing it. A, what's called kache mizbeach. You want it to be offered on the altar. You dedicated this animal to go as an actual sacrifice. In other cases, a person would have an animal that he knows cannot be brought as a sacrifice, but he wants to give it to the temple treasury so they can sell it and make money. In this case, you have what's called kedushas damim. The animal to begin with never becomes holy in its body. It only becomes holy for its worth. Those are called karbanes bedek habayis. You have sacrifices that were donated to the temple treasury. Ein oisin Temurah. Says the Rambam, we have a special rule. If you look in the verses, they don't effectuate Temurah. Shenemar b'maiser, because when it comes to maiser, the animal tithe, that's the original context here. This verse over here talks about maiser behema. It says lo yevaker ben toiv l'ra v'lo yemirenu. Torah, in addition to saying the general prohibition of Temurah, it adds it again by maiser, that the animal tithe should not be exchanged. We have a rule. We say it every morning before Haidu, Rabbi Yishmael Eimer, the 13 principles of exegesis in the Torah. It says, maiser b'chal kol hakadoshim haya. Maiser is like any holy sacrifice. There's a separate verse that says, over here, don't exchange it. Any holy animals. So why, v'lama yatsa? Why did it become particularly excluded and delineated on its own? When Torah repeats something that applies to a general rule in a particular case, l'lamed ala klal, that teaches us a new law about the entire rule. That means we have to look at Maiser, and Maiser will become the prototype to teach us where the laws of Temurah apply. Ma Maiser karban yachid. First of all, we learn from this, the same way an animal tithe is an individual sacrifice, only individual sacrifices could have Temurah. Yatsu karbanes tzibur v'chein ashutfin. That excludes communal sacrifices and partnership sacrifices. Second, ma Maiser karban mizbeach. The same way an animal tithe goes directly on the altar. So in order to have Temurah, it has to be that kind of sacrifice. Yatsu kache bedek habayis. That excludes animals that were sanctified just for their money to the temple treasury. And number three, ma maiser behema. Hukash l'maiser dagan. The same way the animal tithe was compared to the grain tithe. Shein chayavin bayali Yisrael v'lei nachrim, where only Jews and not Gentiles are obligated in it. Yatsu karbanis nachrim shein oisin Temurah. This also therefore excludes Gentile sacrifices, at least biblically, as we explained, that they do not effectuate Temurah on a biblical level. Halacha Yud Gimel hamakdish balas mum kavua. If somebody sanctifies an animal that already has a blemish, to begin with, it's blemished, it's never going to be a sacrifice. Eina isa Temurah. So, since it can never be offered on the altar, it cannot effectuate Temurah. Because in this case, the body of the animal never became fully holy. The Eina Ella, Kidushas Damim, it's only a monetary holiness. But if a person were to sanctify an animal with a passing blemish, it's going to heal. Or he sanctified an animal that was whole, unblemished. And later on it got a blemish. That means when it was sanctified originally, it was fully holy, even in its body. It could effectuate Temurah because it began as a fully holy sacrifice. Halacha Yudalit. Echad hameimir tamim bebalmum. Oy balmum betamim. It doesn't matter if you exchange an unblemished animal with a blemished one, or a blemished one for an unblemished one. Again, even if you're rising to better, doesn't matter, better or worse. Or a cattle to a sheep, or sheep to cattle, like kvasim beizim, beizim bekvasim, sheep to goats, goats to sheep, females to males, males to females. Even if you exchange 1 to 100 or 100 to 1. You took one sacrifice and you say, I want the holiness to go to 100 new animals. You're donating 100 times more than your original sacrifice. And certainly the opposite. You have 100 animal sacrifices that you want to just put onto one regular animal. Whether you did it at one shot or one after another. Harezu Temurah, in all cases, it is Temurah. It's a valid exchange. The leikin kiminyan abehemes shehemer, and you'll get lashes based on the number of animals which you exchanged. Which means in the case of 1 to 100, you get 100 lashes because you've exchanged 100 animals. And in the case of 100 to 1, you only get 1 lashes because you've only exchanged 1 animal, essentially. And therefore you only get 1 lashes. Halacha tezvav ein ha-temurah oisa temurah. An exchange cannot make an exchange. So here we have the actual sacrifice. Here's the animal that you exchanged it to. This animal is not powerful enough to transfer its holiness to another animal. Also babies cannot make Temurah. That means you have an animal sacrifice. If this animal were to be exchanged, the mom, it would be Temurah. But if it has a baby while it's sanctified, that baby is like secondary degree. It's not powerful enough to make Temurah. Because it says in the Torah, back to the original verse, V'hayahu usmurasai. It and its exchange. Hu v'lei vladai, that means it, not its baby. Usmurasai v'lei tmurasai, its exchange, but not its exchange's exchange. Aval hameimir b'vehema. But as long as it isn't second degree, as long as it's the original animal, let's say this, a person has a sacrifice and he wants to exchange this animal for another one. V'chazar v'heimir ba. And then he exchanges again with it. So I want to transfer this to this animal. And then he says, I want to transfer this, again, the original sacrifice, to this animal. The chazar v'hemer, and a third time, afilu elef, even 1,000 times, kulan Temurah, they're all in exchange. The leikal kol echad echad kamesher b'arnu, and each one carries a separate lashes, as we explained. Because as long as you're relating to the original animal, that's a valid exchange. Halacha tazayin ein memirin evarim ayubarim bishleimim. We cannot exchange limbs or fetuses to whole animals. V'lo shleimim bahem. Nor can we exchange whole animals to fetuses or limbs. Meaning what? Ketzat. A person says, Ragla shel behemazu oyada tachas elazu. Here, I have an animal. It's a burnt offering. I want to transfer the holiness to a foot or a hand of another animal. Oisha amar ubar behemazu tachas elazu. Or you say the fetus in this animal is instead of this burnt offering. Eina Temurah. It's not an exchange. Or a person says the other way. Behemazu tachas yada ragla shel elazu. I have a burnt offering. I want to transfer just the holiness of the foot or the hand onto another animal. Or I have a sin offering that's pregnant, because a chatas is a female offering. So you have a female offering, it's pregnant, there's a baby inside. I want the baby to be exchanged onto this animal. Eina Temurah, not Temurah. Because again, Temurah cannot involve fetuses or just partial limbs of an animal. Halacha Yudzayin hameimir b'kilayim. A person does Temurah with a hybrid animal, born from a mixture. A betrefor, or a mortally wounded animal. A v'yetzei doifen, or a C-section animal. A betumtum b'andregenes, or an animal that you don't know what it's a man or a woman, a male or female. Eina kedusha chala aleyen. Holiness does not take effect on them. You may as well have exchanged it to a camel or a donkey. It doesn't work. Because these types of animals can never be offered as a sacrifice. Therefore you don't get lashes. How come before we said a blemished animal, Temurah would work? Because balmum yesh b'minay karban. A blemished animal, right now it's blemished, but its type of animal could be offered as a sacrifice. Eloin b'minan karban, not these. Hybrid, C-section, no other animal like it could be offered as a sacrifice. It's just forbidden. And therefore, Temurah cannot be done. An animal that was involved in bestiality, in relations with a human, it's like a blemish. Because the category of the animal could be offered as a sacrifice. This one cannot, but the category could. And therefore they could effectuate Temurah, and same applies to all similar situations. An animal is half holy and half not. How's that possible? Two partners sanctified it and one pulled out, let's say. Right? And now you have a half and half holy animal. It cannot be involved in any way. It cannot be made Temurah, it cannot make others Temurah. Because it's not neither or. It's not holy or it's not mundane. All sin offerings that have to be consigned to die, as we had in the last book. A baby of a sin offering whose owner died, a sin offering that was used in exchange, a sin offering that was lost and then found later. They have to be left to die. They cannot be used in a Temurah exchange. Any sin offering that the law is, it has to be left to graze till it gets a blemish and then it's going to be sold. It could effectuate Temurah because it's still holy while it's waiting to get the blemish. What if you put aside an animal that's not fit? A female animal for a burnt offering or for a Passover offering or for a guilt offering. All these have to be a male. You put aside a female. Oysa Temurah, says the Rambam, fascinating law. It could effectuate Temurah. Hayil v'yardu ligdushas damim v'harehim tmimim. Once they could be sanctified in a way of their money, and they're unblemished, yardu ligdushas aguf. They also become holy in their body. It's a very interesting novelty that applies in this case. Aval hamafrish soy lechatasei. But if somebody puts aside a male goat for a sin offering, it has to be a female. V'nasi shehifrish seira lechatasei, or if a king who's supposed to bring a male goat brings a female goat for his sin offering, or a high priest, instead of a bull, he puts a cow, female cow, they don't effectuate Temurah. Because when it comes to sin offerings, a special rule, if you exchange them, it doesn't become holy at all, even monetarily. As we explained in the laws of disqualified sacrifices, that sin offerings are different, and therefore, even if you exchange it, it doesn't work.